Okay, so this week we're talking a lot about rounding numbers to a given place value. So this is lesson 7 homework, and their task is to round to the nearest thousand. Now, I have the number 5,900. So the rule is that you need to look at what you're rounding to. You're rounding to the thousand and underline that place value. So we underline the 5 because that's in the thousands place. So the first job is to see what's the lowest 5,000 can be on our number line for the bottom. Well, the rule is when we turn everything into a 0 after the underlined digit, we have just plain old 5,000. Okay, and then the next step is to add a copy to that place value. So underline the thousands again because that's the one we're working with. If we add a copy of 1,000 to 5,000, we end up with 6,000 at the top. Now, finding the midpoint is really hard for fourth graders. So I've just been telling them to be patient with this and that we're going to practice it and that it'll get easier. So the midpoint between 1,000, we've been talking a lot about how 5 is a common number in a lot of midpoints. So it's the midpoint between 0 and 10 is 5. The midpoint between 10 and 20 is 15. So the midpoint between 1,000, if you were to cut it in half, would be 500. So the midpoint here would be 5,500. All right, so now does 5,900 live closer to 6,000? Or does it live closer to 5,000, those 2 points? The midpoint is just a guide. So kind of take your pencil and say where it's going to stop. And 5,900 would live right under 6,000. So your answer in this box would be whichever one it was closer to. It was closer to the 6,000. So 5,900 is about 6,000. All right. If I go to the back, this is what we learned today. So this is lesson 8, and this is getting into the 100,000s and the 10,000s. So 1 says 67 rounded to the nearest 10,000 is what? So if I go and I look and I'm seeing 10,000s, I underline my 10,000, which is a 6. So my rule is that I turn everything else into a 0 to get the lowest 60,000 could be, which is plain old 60,000. If I were to add a 10,000, a copy of 10,000 to 60,000, I would end up with 70,000. So the rule for the 10,000s is the midpoint is 5,000. So if you were to cut 10,000 in half, it would be 5,000. So there's going to be a 5,000 somewhere in this midpoint. So the midpoint is going to be 65,000. And kind of a trick is looking at these two, covering up the zeros and looking at those 2 digits, looking at the 60 and looking at the 70, and thinking of what's going to be the midpoint between 60 and 70. And that kind of helps kids because those zeros can get confusing. So if you just cover it up, you can check your answer because it might be easier to tell that that is the clear midpoint between 60 and 70. So then ask yourself where 67,000 would live. Is it going to live between 65 and 70 or 60 and 65? And you will come to find that it lives right here because if it were 65 and 70 without the zeros, 67 would live between those two. So the answer is that it's closer to 70,000. All right, so in the 100,000s, on number 2, we have 867,000. So to the nearest 100,000, we're going to underline the 8. That is our 100,000. So make everything else a 0 because that's the lowest 800,000 can be. And then add a copy of 100,000 to get to the top of our number line, 900,000. Now, the same trick kind of applies here, not so much in the thousands, but in the 10,000, the 100,000s is a really good trick. If you cover up the zeros, what would be the midpoint between 800 and 900? It would be 850. Because if you cut 100,000 in half, it would be 50,000. So 50,000 is what we're going to see when we're rounding to the 100,000s. But you can check your answer by looking at just those 3 numbers. and 850 would be the midpoint. So 867,000 would live between 800,000 or 850,000, 850,000 or 900,000. And kids will find that it lands right above the 850,000. So their answer would be that it is closer to the 900,000 mark.